Hello, my name is Holger Schünemann, and I will be narrating Module 3 of the Introduction to WHO Guidelines and Grade. Module 3 is entitled Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation, in short, GRADE, Assessing Certainty of Evidence. As I said, this is the third of 6 modules. It is narrated based on slides. There are separate quizzes, and you can go at your own pace. Before I begin, here are my disclosures. I do not have any direct financial conflicts of interest. I'm co-chair of the GRADE Working Group. I'm director of Cochrane Canada, and I'm on the board of the Guidelines International Network. We've received funding from the World Health Organization for this work that went to my home institution, McMaster University. The views expressed are my own. Module 3 is about GRADE, grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation, assessing certainty of evidence. The topics that I will be covering in Module 3 are the following: causation and its relation to the levels and certainty of evidence. What is GRADE? The type of questions we ask about interventions and other types of questions. The domains of assessing certainty, describing them both in lay and scientific language, providing a final rating of the certainty of a body of evidence, and presenting summary of findings, tables, and evidence profiles. I will end with a description of how to communicate the certainty of evidence and effect sizes. This shows a seminal paper by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, in which he addressed aspects of association and causation. In other words, whether or not an exposure A causes an outcome X. Some of the aspects that he described were the strength of an association, for instance, the relation between smoking and lung cancer, biological gradients, the degree of exposure, for instance, radiation exposure and the risk of cancer, and whether or not an experiment was performed, for instance, randomization versus observation. The work by Austin Bradford Hill had some big impact on how levels of evidence were conceptualized and how recommendations in healthcare were actually developed. For instance, the Canadian Task Force on the Periodic Health Examination, called the Periodic Health Examination, developed levels of evidence that were based on the effectiveness of an intervention. They separated different levels: Roman level 1, 2.1, 2.2, and Roman level 3, as levels of evidence that supported whether or not an effect was actually potentially true. That led, in turn, to recommendations about certain health interventions. Recommendations, for instance, labeled as A, were supported by good evidence based on that approach. Recommendations level C were supported by poor evidence regarding, for instance, an inclusion of a periodic health examination for a certain condition in these guidelines. So it started with systems such as the periodic health examination that allowed us to evaluate the levels of evidence based on study designs by the Canadian Task Force in 1979. It moved to a definition by the Institute of Medicine, where recommendations or guidelines were defined as systematically developed statements to assist practitioner and patient decisions about appropriate healthcare for specific clinical circumstances. But that moved to newer definitions, for instance, the definition from 2011 and 2018 from the IOM and WHO respectively, such as statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care that are informed by a systematic review of evidence and an assessment of the benefits and harms of alternative care options. Guidelines should assist providers, including those who make decisions about clinical public health and health policy based on WHO definitions. But there was further development, and that is that these levels of evidence developed into something that we call the great certainty of evidence, separated into 4 levels: very low, low, moderate, and high, and a recommendation that would result from an evaluation of that evidence, but based on transparent and structured criteria that go beyond the simple evidence about an intervention's effect, such as what the underlying values of the target population would be, what the underlying resources that would be required are to implement an intervention, such as a therapy, considerations around equity, acceptability, and feasibility, in addition to evaluating the benefits and harms of an option. So in short, that approach that I will be describing, that you just saw on the previous slide, which provides a transparent way to formulating recommendations and assessing evidence, came from Bradford Hill, who described aspects of causation. It went through developments by, for instance, the Canadian task force that I described, formulating levels of evidence very much based on study designs, such as randomized controlled trials, RCTs, and observational studies, to a transparent and structured framework that separated the assessment of the certainty, operationalized it, from the development of recommendations. So such as the certainty and evidence that is based on domains, and as I will explain, not study design focused, but taking a holistic approach to assessing a body of evidence where the risk of bias and applicability or indirectness play a big role. The GREAT working group thus set as its goal to develop a unifying, transparent, and sensible system for grading the certainty of evidence and making recommendations, all of that supported by tools such as the GREAT Pro guideline development tool. The group has worked with organizations such as the World Health Organization, but also other big professional societies, as well as government and non-government organizations, academic institutions, for over 20 years since the year 2000, and helped over 100 of these organizations to either develop GREAT or use GREAT. There are over 1,000 members globally. GREAT is for systematic reviews, health technology assessments, and guidelines. It is extremely frequently cited in publications. Official GREAT guidance exists. Concept articles that explain new developments in GREAT, and they are published widely, as I said. And there is the GREAT handbook, all of that integrated into this GREAT Pro app that I already mentioned. The GREAT working group has many GREAT centers and networks across continents. You see them here described. As of 2021 spring, there are 19 of these centers and networks that exist and help implementing and further develop GREAT. Let me give you an example. Here's an example of a WHO recommendation from the Global TB Department. This recommendation reads, in patients with tuberculous meningitis and initial adjuvant corticosteroid therapy with dexamethasone or prednisolone tapered over 6 to 8 weeks should be used. The recommendation is labeled as strong, and the certainty of the evidence supporting it is labeled as moderate. The certainty of evidence expresses whether or not we are sure in the effects of an intervention. The questions that we ask and that GREAT has helped operationalize are actually relatively straightforward. They include what are the limitations of the studies that were included to support that recommendation? Are the results consistent when they should be consistent? Are the results precise? How directly does the research evidence apply to the population or the setting, the interventions and the outcomes of interest? Is this really all the research evidence that exists? And if there are any issues that increase the confidence in the results, for instance, large effects or dose-response relations. Separate from that is the decision about the direction and strength of a recommendation. For instance, whether or not to recommend or suggest corticosteroids with dexamethasone or prednisolone in this particular context. And that is a result of an evaluation of whether or not the desirable consequences outweigh the undesirable consequences, where the benefits and harms, so the effects of the intervention, play one big role, but are not the only deciding criteria. So, for instance, it has to do with resources, whether or not the intervention is acceptable, feasible, and equity that would influence, at the end of the day, whether or not the desirable consequences outweigh the undesirable consequences. Following from that, it becomes very clear that there are different types of questions that one would ask in a recommendation development effort. There's the guideline question, the typical should question that, for instance, would read, should intervention A or B be used for people with condition X? There is the evidence of intervention effects that need to be described, typically in a question format that follows the population intervention comparison outcome or PICO format, and should be informed by systematic reviews or health technology assessments, HTA. But that is only one aspect. In other words, whether or not in people with X, what is the impact of A compared with B on outcomes 1, 2, 3 is really sufficient in order to inform a recommendation. In other words, it typically is not. For instance, what is always critical is what value do people actually place on the outcomes that are considered, in particular the people who are suffering from the condition of interest. Cost effectiveness plays a role. I mentioned feasibility and so on. And all of these questions can be addressed in systematic reviews that address that specific question, which at the end of the day will inform a recommendation or a coverage decision, which provides the answer to the should question. In other words, in people with X, the guideline development group recommends to suggest using A rather than B or B rather than A. That latter part, whether or not the desirable consequences outweigh the undesirable consequences or vice versa, is part of the next module. I will focus for now on this upper part, the certainty of the evidence. So I'm coming back to the types of questions, and we'll focus on that one question that deals with the impact of an intervention. I will use an example from a TB guideline that focuses on the treatment of tuberculosis. The question is, should initial adjuvant corticosteroids be used for people with tuberculous meningitis? The typical systematic review of intervention effects question could read, in people with tuberculous meningitis, what is the impact of initial adjuvant corticosteroids compared with not using them on the outcomes mortality, relapse, and adverse events? The answer to that question here, which is informed by the systematic review of impacts, would be then expressed in the recommendation. For instance, in people with tuberculous meningitis, the guideline development group recommends or suggests not using or using initial adjuvant corticosteroids. So what does that certainty of the evidence that we are addressing here really mean? A definition of the certainty of evidence of the effects is that it's the certainty that an estimate of association or effect is correct, or better, that a true effect lies on one side of a specified threshold or within a chosen range. Research evidence typically starts as high certainty evidence, and as I already mentioned, in GRADE there are 4 levels of the certainty of evidence: high, moderate, low, and very low. Returning to our PICO question, that is, In people with tuberculous meningitis, what is the impact of the addition of initial adjuvant corticosteroids compared to no addition of initial adjuvant corticosteroids, which clarifies that we are talking about an additional treatment on mortality, relapse, adverse events. Typical PICO question, as I already described. That PICO question was informed at the time when this guideline was published in 2017 by 5 randomized controlled trials that were conducted across the globe. Here we see the 5 studies that addressed it, the relative estimate of the effect. I'm making it quite simple here by just showing the risk ratio or relative risk. That means the same thing. For the individual studies, the weight is an indication of how large these studies actually were, or how many events took place, how much they contributed to the overall estimate of the effect that we are seeing here, and which expresses the effect across studies of adjuvant corticosteroids in patients with tuberculous meningitis on mortality. A relative risk of 0.72 means that the risk in the intervention group is 0.72-fold the risk in the comparison group that did not receive the corticosteroids. Or in other words, there's a 28%, 1 minus 0.72, 28% relative risk reduction. The confidence intervals for this overall estimate of the effect go from 0.52 to 1.0. This is the forest plot describing both the individual studies, point estimate here, the blue square, confidence interval, the horizontal line for each of the studies, and the diamond, the effect across studies that I already described here. So that was the overall estimate of the effect, 5 randomized controlled trials. I'll now take you through an assessment of the evidence. The first question, as I already described, is what are the limitations of the studies? An explanation for that is that we are looking for limitations in the detailed study design and execution. The formal term that we use is risk of bias, also called internal validity. It is assessed by study and then across studies. An example, for instance, is studies that are not randomized trials not having been blinded when they should have been blinded, loss to follow-up of participants, observational study analysis having not been adjusted for important confounders. In our specific example, just as an overview, 1 out of 5 randomized trials was not blinded with regards to participants and outcome assessors, but the systematic review team thought that that was not a major concern because that study did not differ in its result, and overall that led to not lowering our certainty in the evidence sufficiently to bring it down from high to moderate. This is actually an important aspect, that judgment is involved. That judgment should be made transparent, reasons should be provided, such as in this case, the study not influencing the results, importantly, and that a structured approach is actually followed. The next question that we ask is, are the results of studies consistent? The explanation is, do studies that should be showing similar results because they were similar in their conduct and were included in the inclusion criteria, through the inclusion criteria of the systematic reviews, indeed show similar results, or are there unexplained differences? The formal term that is used is inconsistency. It is assessed across studies using results of individual studies. And example items are whether or not the confidence intervals of individual studies are overlapping, the point estimates differ widely, whether or not formal tests and measures of statistical heterogeneity that I will not go into further are showing that the results are different due to chance, or probably as a result of a systematic difference being different. Our example of the tuberculous meningitis treatment indicated that there were no problems with inconsistency. The confidence intervals were overlapping. The point estimates were similar enough when one considered the study weight, and the statistical measures were not a problem. There was no concern, in other words, no rating down. The next question that we ask is, are the results of studies actually precise? In other words, is randomness playing an important role in the explanation of the results, or are the results due to chance? The formal term that is used is imprecision. It is assessed across studies using the results of the individual studies, ideally on the basis of a meta-analysis, which is a statistical summary of all of the individual studies, also called pooling. Example items are whether or not the effects are compatible with benefits and harms at the same time. That leads to telling us that there's probably a random error involved, when there are few observed events in the included studies across the studies, or if there are few participants in the studies. In other words, whether or not there are wide confidence intervals of the overall effect. In our example, the effect on mortality could be quite large or not existent at all, based on the confidence interval of the relative risk, which went from 0.52 to 1.0. In this case, the systematic review authors actually had a concern and rated down the certainty from high to moderate. The next question deals with how directly the research evidence applies to the question of interest. The explanation is, do studies directly address the population's intervention comparisons and outcomes of interest? It encompasses epidemiological concepts such as applicability, generalizability, transferability, translatability, external validity, and so on. The formal term that is used is indirectness. It is done by study and across studies. Example items are, for instance, whether or not the studied intervention is the exact intervention of interest in terms of dosing, the mode of administration, and similar defining features of an intervention. In our example, the direct evidence for the population intervention comparison and outcomes really matched the question of interest, and there was no concern. The next question we ask is this really all of the research evidence that exists? The explanation is there research evidence that has not been identified and may actually contradict the observed results? The formal term that we use in GRADE is publication bias. It is assessed across studies using results of individual studies. Example items are only small studies that confirm investigators' perception of the effects of an intervention are available, but additional studies were actually conducted. However, these results are not available or have not been published. In our example, however, there was no suspicion of publication bias and therefore no concern. Finally, there are domains that may increase our confidence in the effects. Those are factors that make an effect or absence of an effect more likely. For instance, dose-response relations, large effects, or if opposing plausible residual bias can increase our confidence in either an effect being present or being absent. It is assessed across studies using results of individual studies. For instance, a very large effect across observational studies that do not have additional limitations in the design and execution and that are precise would lead to increasing the certainty of the evidence. These domains primarily address observational or non-randomized studies, and they are not applicable in our example. So to bring this together, the assessment of the certainty and the evidence by outcome, or GRADE's approach to rating certainty, which we also call quality of evidence, it's also known as confidence in the effect estimates, happens as follows. It is done for each outcome. I showed you the outcome mortality based on that question or for that question, based on a systematic review, and then it is done across outcomes, which I will explain in one of the subsequent slides. Typically, what happens is that a body of evidence from randomized trials, or those that are evaluated with a specific tool that equates non-randomized studies with randomized trials for a risk of bias assessment, start as high certainty. Observational studies, or those that are not assessed using that Robbins I tool, start at low certainty. 5 domains that can lead to lowering the certainty that I described, and 3 domains that can lead to increasing the certainty. Once that assessment has been done, the certainty is judged as either high, moderate, low, or very low based on transparent domains. So for instance, a body of evidence that starts at high certainty and has limitations that are sufficient in terms of severity to lower the certainty either go to moderate, low, or very low certainty. For observational studies, the same domains apply beyond randomization. So additional risk of bias, such as not adjusting for confounders, is the potential limitation that might lower the certainty of the evidence to low or very low. And at the same time, it may increase the certainty of the evidence to high or moderate if any of the three domains apply that lead to increasing the certainty of the evidence. So for our example, a transparent assessment could look as follows. There were 5 studies, randomized controlled trials. We looked at the individual domains, and we thought that there was, or the systematic review authors thought that there was one particular problem, and that related to imprecision. They therefore lowered the certainty for that one judgment to moderate certainty, shown here. They did not have concerns about other domains. What is really important to mention is that the domains are not completely independent of each other. Imprecision and inconsistency in a meta-analysis may relate to each other, and so on. And they then expressed the estimates of the effect based on the absolute numbers here. Here, particularly, there were 877 patients enrolled in the studies, with the event rates shown here for a relative risk of 0.72, an absolute effect based on this baseline risk of 97 fewer per 1,000, or 9.7% reduction in mortality, moderate certainty, and that outcome was considered critical for decision-making. In GRADE, we do that type of assessment for each of the outcomes that are considered critical or important for decision-making. It's shown here, and it is then presented in what we call an evidence profile containing the information that I just showed for each of the outcomes that are relevant for the process of decision-making, or a summary of findings table, which is a similar approach, just with a shorter way of presenting the information. It describes the certainty and quality then across outcomes for a recommendation, or it can be derived from it, such as, first of all, here, the results for the individual outcomes, relative and absolute estimates, and the quality or certainty of the evidence, moderate, moderate, low, and moderate for the 4 outcomes. The overall certainty is determined by the lowest certainty of any of the critical outcomes. And that is based on the fact that for decision-making, the uncertainty related to anything that is critical will influence your overall balance of potential health benefits and harms. There's an exception to the rule that I'm showing here. That is when either a non-critical outcome has lower certainty, or when all outcomes, one being lower in terms of certainty, when all outcomes point in the same direction and more evidence is unlikely to influence the overall decision, such as in this case, where the overall rating was a moderate rating of the certainty because mortality and death went in the same direction, suggesting benefit with moderate certainty. Even the adverse events did that, and relapse, therefore, also pointing in the same direction of a benefit, not influencing the overall recommendation. Therefore, the overall certainty here was described as moderate. So what are we doing when we rate the certainty of the evidence? This cartoon that we used in GRADE quite a few times is actually explaining this quite well. One meteorologist saying to another, I figure there's a 40% chance of rain and a 10% chance we know what we are talking about. It expresses the magnitude of an effect, such as in a weather prediction model, and the certainty that we have in that prediction of rain, for instance. If the weather model was developed in Australia and is applied in Europe, then our certainty is certainly lowered, such as applicability in this particular case. And how do we interpret the certainty of the evidence? GRADE has provided interpretation aids where high certainty means that we are very confident that the true effect lies close to that of the estimate of the effect, or within a range or beyond a certain threshold that we have defined. And this goes down to very low certainty that basically is defined as or interpreted as we have very little confidence in the effect estimate. The true effect is likely to be substantially different from the actual estimate of the effect. So returning to that, if we think about that first estimate of the effect for mortality and the certainty of the evidence, that then needs to be expressed to lay audiences. And how do we do that? Based on that certainty assessment and the magnitude of the effect. There's a nice publication from the year 2020 that describes, based on user testing, how to express the combination of the certainty of the evidence and the magnitude of the effect, which inevitably is a judgment. So for instance, in this particular case, this was judged to be a moderate effect. Here's a description, a moderate effect based on moderate certainty of the evidence, and that could read as follows. Initial adjuvant corticosteroid therapy probably reduces mortality, and this is based, as I said, on a moderate effect described here in relative and in absolute terms, and based on moderate certainty. So in summary, I spoke about the relation between causation and then the levels and certainty of evidence as an introduction. I introduced grade and the types of questions that are being addressed. By the way, grade is applicable to any of these types of questions. We focus today on intervention effects, but it's applicable or can be used for prognostic questions, for test accuracy questions, for questions about values that people have. The domains are always very similar. I spoke about the domains of assessing the certainty both in lay and scientific language. I provided information about the final rating of the certainty. I informed you about how information can be expressed in summary of findings, tables, and evidence profiles that have been widely tested, even in randomized studies, whether or not people understand them. And then I spoke about communicating the certainty of evidence and the effect size using templates. What follows are the quizzes that you can actually take at your own pace. So the next quiz question is, try to answer the question before I continue to the next slide. The following domains are named as part of the grade assessment of the certainty of the evidence: trust in the results, publication bias, number of studies included in evidence review, lack of reproducibility, or retrospective studies. You should stop now in order to self-test yourself. The answer, or the correct answer, is publication bias. The other domains are not really named in grade. The second quiz question is, grade is a rigid approach that does not consider original concepts of epidemiology and causation. Is that true or false? You should stop now and answer before I move on. This is false. The grade approach emphasizes transparency and is built on the foundations of health research methods, their trustworthiness, and epidemiological concepts such as bias and effect sizes. Going to the third quiz question. Grade includes the following domains in its assessment of the certainty of evidence: risk of bias, inconsistency, imprecision, indirectness, or all of the above. You should stop now to answer the question. The answer is all of them apply. In other words, the 8 key grade domains include risk of bias, inconsistency, imprecision, indirectness, publication bias, dose response relations, opposing plausible bias, and confounding and large effects. Thank you so much.